Okay, so good morning to everyone. We have the pleasure to introduce you to the greatest American economist, considered an authority on the history and theory of free banking. On his books, he reflects the most important views and debates on economics amongst history. So, regarding the Ecuadorian economy, we all know that 15 years ago, Ecuador changed its national currency from sucre to the US dollar. And for Ecuadorian citizens, this was a change on monetary policy that affected their savings in a very drastic way. So, causing a division between the population upon either it was needed or either it was not needed this extreme measure. So, commemorating the 15th anniversary of the Ecuadorian dollarization, what is your general opinion about this system?
My general opinion is that the economy is doing much better now than it was in 1999. I think that's the most dramatic thing. But let me challenge the premise of your question a little bit. I don't think it was such a drastic change to the savings of the Ecuadorian people because they had already dollarized their own savings. The estimates of how dollarized the savings were something like 80%. So it wasn't that big a change. Everybody knew the US dollar, everybody kept track of the exchange rate every day. Everybody was already calculating in dollars. But it meant that they no longer had to deal with the instability of the sucre, which was a big improvement.
Let's speak about the money as you see it, that is an institution that comes from the people to use something. Mm-hmm. So from this point of view, the dollarization is not the money is something that is not something that the government manage, it's something that the people use. So how do you see the Ecuadorian example in this context?
I see it as very much a bottom-up development. As you're suggesting, the people had a choice between holding sucres and holding dollars, and they voted with their pocketbooks, so they voted with their wallets to hold dollars. And eventually, the sucre became so unstable that the government conceded to the decision that the people had made. So I see this as a change brought about from the bottom up by the people, and the government finally got out of the way. I mean, it's been different in some other countries. I mean, in El Salvador, they were not having high inflation, and it was more of a government top-down decision. The economy was not so dollarized. But here it was very much spontaneous development.
It's quite interesting where you said conceded. It was not a decision from the government, it was not an imposition, it conceded what the people had.
That's right.
Really choose.
It was not an imposition. To try to keep the sucre would have been an imposition.
It was an imposition for the 96, 97, 98, 99, when the people didn't really want that money.
I'm sure nobody in the public sector wanted to be paid in sucres, nobody wanted to pay their taxes in sucres, and so on.
What do you think? Do you think it is an example from any other countries the way that Ecuador dollarized his economy?
Well, it's still early. Panama's had much longer time with dollarization, but I hope that Ecuador will provide another example of a country that the economy became more stable under dollarization. It looks that way, and so. Other countries, especially those that are having bad trouble with their monies, those that are having high inflation, can look at it as a better alternative. Just a very practical measure to take.
Very practical, that's another. But in this practical way, the country lost, some people say, or some economists say, that the people lost its sovereignty. What do you think about that?
There is this long-standing idea that to be a sovereign nation, you have to issue your own currency. But in the 1960s, every new country in Africa thought they needed their own airline to be a sovereign country. And it makes about as much sense. You don't lose your sovereignty by importing automobiles. You don't lose your sovereignty by importing another country's unit of account. If it's better than what you've produced on your own, why not do that? You still have control of your own taxes and expenditures. You still have control of all your own government functions.
And
you're not taking orders from the United States.
From an historical point of view, how many countries had, when this idea that the sovereignty belongs to the currency, or the money and the sovereignty are so related, when this idea became true?
Well, if you go back to the days before, the very early days of monetary development, merchants in the market developed coinage. Right? Pieces of gold and silver were not very uniform as they come out of the mine. So when the metallurgy developed, it became possible to stamp them into uniform pieces. And sovereigns very quickly discovered that this was a good way to extract revenue from the economy. So they monopolized the mint. And with the development of bank-issued money, banknotes and checking deposits, they decided that this was also a good source of revenue.
Let's not forget that sovereignty became from sovereign, from the king. So
That's
this
right.
idea that the king has the power. So one person had the power over the whole economy. So some people that say sovereignty is like you are losing the point. It's like, do you really want so one person taking over the whole economy?
That's right. I mean, if you talk about the sovereignty of the people, well, the people can make their own choice about what money to use.
Yeah. Nowadays, how many countries have other currencies, and how many countries in history have had other currencies? How many times this situation had taken place?
Well, if you look at the period of the classical gold standard, if you look at the 19th century up through the First World War, all the leading countries were on the gold standard. And it wasn't the product of any one country. It was an international money. It was a commodity money. So you could say that no country was sovereign in choosing their own money. They used the international money. They didn't try to impose their own unique money on their citizens. And the adoption of a external currency like the dollar is about as close as a country like Ecuador can come to something like the international gold standard, finding a stable international currency to use. The number of central banks in the world actually has been, with their own unique currencies, has been declining in recent years. Of course, in Europe, there's a multinational central bank, so no individual country in the Eurozone controls its own monetary policy.
So this idea of the sovereignty related with a central bank and related with a currency is something just from a short period of time of the 20th century that begins with the Federal Reserve Bank, more or less, the beginning of the 20th century, till the ending of the 20th century, because at the ending of the 20th century, with the euro, many other countries became to do the other way, to denationalize the money.
That's right. So it's the period of the rise of the nation state and the control over the issuing of paper money as a source of revenue. But now countries are saying that it may not always be worth it. They can get a better currency by importing it.
As in the euro, as in Salvador, as in Ecuador, as in many other countries.
Right. The countries in the Eurozone who had very high inflation before the euro, Spain, Italy, Greece, it's a much better money than they were producing on their own. So the only difference between that and dollarization is they have a vote on the policy-making board. But I've asked my friends in Panama, wouldn't you like to have a vote on the Federal Reserve Open Market Committee? And they said, no, don't put one of our politicians on that.
And actually, you have one vote over 25 people, so it's not that.
That's right. It's not decisive.
Yeah. Let's speak about the dollarization from the Ecuadorian point of view, because some people say, okay, but you are losing your monetary policy, so you are linking your economy with the American economy, and it can hurt the Ecuadorian economy. What do you think about that?
Well, losing your monetary policy is the best part of it. If your monetary policy is as terrible as the Sucre was in the late 1990s. So, putting a limit on the damage that monetary policy can do is a very good thing. When I'm at home, I argue for limiting the discretion of the Federal Reserve System as much as possible.
You mentioned this paper of Jeffrey Sachs in 1999,
right?
And those other economists who advise for a strong government with a strong monetary policy.
Right.
What do you think? Not about his paper, about this kind of economist, that kind of advices, and what do you can say to them 15 years later in the light of the dollarization or the examples that?
So some economists, including Jeffrey Sachs, were concerned about the loss of macroeconomic policy by countries that were having macroeconomic difficulties. They say, oh, this is a desperate measure, and you'd be better off running your own policy because then you could customize it to the conditions in your country. But if you look at the actual practice, that wasn't happening. I think it's pretty clear 15 years later that all the macroeconomic indicators are better in Ecuador than they were before dollarization. Right? So inflation is lower, interest rates are lower, real output is not as volatile.
So does he say something 15 years later? All those economists that in the 90s were speaking about soft policy, monetary policy, do they say something 15 years later, or they still say the very same with the very same arguments, as if nothing happened?
I haven't heard them talking about it lately. I mean, you sometimes hear echoes of the same argument when people say, well, Greece could solve its problems if it could leave the Eurozone
exactly
and devalue its own currency, but that didn't work. I mean, money is not that kind of magic that real problems go away just by cheapening your money. You just create more problems.
Yeah, so let's speak about a little bit about methodology. Because, I mean, we have this example of 15 years of a new and strange and a strong measure of dollarization. And then we have this example 15 years later. And I have this sensation that the economics world, economic people, they don't really see what's going on. They don't. I think they don't see what's going. They still see the economics books, what they used to say about monetary policy, and they don't see what's really happening.
Too many economists think of it. Look at the system from the top down, and they say, if I were the expert advisor, I could balance things in a beautiful way. They don't think about what actually happens when central banks are pressured by political authorities. They tend to look at the theory rather than the actual practice. And they kind of overlook the fact that from the point of view of the people, they wanted something better than the currency they had. And so you should think about dollarization from that perspective, from the bottom up, and not just from the point of view of the expert who thinks that they can treat monetary policy as, an engineering problem.
I am proudly an economic professor. Aren't we a little bit guilty of that problem? Because we teach our students, if we see the textbooks, we teach how to manage the economics. We don't teach them how to understand the economy. We teach them how to manage the economy.
Well, that's right. And the central banks of the world are the #1 employers of monetary economists. So if you want to train your students to get a job at the central bank, you have to teach them these techniques. But I like to also teach my students, here are the theories we have to explain central banks. Let's not just take it for granted that they are all-knowing and independent. Let's look at the way they actually behave and what their objectives might be.
Let's speak a little bit of the independency of a central bank. Because if the Ecuadorian economy or any other Latin American economy or South European economy would have a real independent central bank that took the measure that it's are good for the economy and not what the government used to say to them, we really didn't need any other currency or any other monetary policy. But what do you think about the independence of the central banks and the American Fed especially?
Well, the American Fed has a mixed record, but it's probably more independent than many central banks. If you look at the percentage of the government budget that's financed by printing money, it's been pretty small. I had a personal experience that was very interesting. Many years ago, 1989 I think it was, I was attending a conference in Buenos Aires, and someone arranged for me to have an interview with the head of the central bank. I don't know why he wanted to talk to me. I was just a young economist. But he said to me, this is before the reform, He said, I know I'm printing too much money, but the government sends me a bill that says, here's the wages we need to pay this month. We need you to print this many Australs. He said, what can I do? That's my job.
It was that straightforward.
It was that straightforward.
Oh my God. Because we have all these theories that they say that the central bank should be independent, or they are really independent, as the European Central Bank is supposed to be independent, but then we have the real world.
A government in desperate fiscal condition will turn to the central bank to pay the bills.
That's really interesting. Let us speak now a little bit about de-dollarization from the American point of view. You are as an American economist. What does it mean for the American government to have another country using their currency?
It means a little bit more seigniorage. It's estimated that more than half of the Federal Reserve notes are outside the United States, and that helps explain why more than half of them are in $100 bills, which most of us don't carry around in our wallets back at home. But it's not such a big source of revenue that it affects their policy. I've never heard of them making policy, in their policy discussions, discussing what will be the impact on the other countries that are using dollars.
And what about from the American people point of view? Because if the dollar is the worldwide currency, and there are half of the dollars are outside the U.S., when the U.S. government makes too much money and makes inflation, it is spread all around the world. So it's probably not linked, the American policy, with the American consumer.
Well, that is a concern. If they print more money and most of it's held abroad, then most of the inflation is experienced abroad. And we have an example of that, which is under the Bretton Woods system. All the leading currencies in Europe and Japan were linked to the US dollar. And the US was able to export inflation to Europe. And as inflation rose, eventually the Europeans could redeem their dollars for gold until the US shut the gold window. But yeah, so it does make it more tempting to run a loose monetary policy. Although I think in that case, the loose US monetary policy was mostly due to domestic concerns, trying to lower unemployment, trying to play the short-run Phillips curve. But yes, I think the more countries use the dollar, the more concerned we in the United States have to be to put stronger restrictions on our central bank. They have explicitly adopted a 2% inflation target now, so that's a recent development, and I hope they're serious about it.
Yeah, but you just have to hope they are serious, because there is not an institutional system that really guarantees that.
Well, when they adopt it themselves, they can unadopt it themselves, right?
That's
so
the
if the Congress gave them a mandate that was clearer, that would be an improvement.
And well, I have a question. Like, what kind of restrictions do you mean? Do you have to put in the central bank of the United States? Explain it better, please.
Well, the ultimate restriction would be to eliminate the Federal Reserve System, but if we
and the Fed.
And the Fed. If we're not going that far, then some kind of explicit rule that says, for example, here's your target for the growth of dollar spending or dollar GDP, and either the salaries of the central bankers depend on their hitting the target, or they get fired if they can't hit the target, or some kind of actual sanctions. But then they no longer sort of make it up as they go along, deciding what's important to do this month. So that would hold them more responsible for what they're doing. Right now, they have almost complete discretion, although, as I said, they've adopted an explicit inflation target.
Let's speak a little bit about seigniorage.
Okay.
Because obviously the Ecuadorian government has lost its seigniorage and it is won by the American government, or the American Federal Reserve. First of all, is it fair to win seigniorage more than to manage a currency? What is a fair seigniorage in a free monetary system? And second, is it the nowadays seigniorage bigger than the fair, or whatever it could be fair. But
Well, it is a price that the economy pays if the way you institute dollarization is to import Federal Reserve notes. And then you have to ask yourself, is it worth the price you're paying? There's another way to link to the dollar, which is through a currency board, and then you earn some interest on the dollar reserves. But we've discovered that currency boards are not as tamper-proof as we thought. Argentina showed us that. Right? They had the currency board not buy U.S. Treasury bonds, but Argentine Treasury bonds denominated in dollars, which were not worth what their face value. So that currency board was subject to speculative attack, and it was attacked. But dollarization completely avoids that problem, so maybe it's worth it. But I have a proposal that I'm going to make Wednesday night, which is you can lower the amount of seigniorage that goes outside the country by letting banks in Ecuador issue paper currency to replace the Federal Reserve notes. And that may seem kind of far-fetched. Who does that? Well, there are a few places in the world that have local currency, but are on an external standard. And the examples I will give are Scotland and Northern Ireland and Hong Kong. There the private banks issue the currency, and so the seigniorage is kept locally, and it doesn't go to the bankers. The bankers are competing, so they have to pay it to the public as a way of competing for business.
We had to go into a very deep and quite complicated issue. You are world famous for the free banking theory, or for the, and what you're proposing us is a free banking in Ecuador. Might you explain us a little bit what is the free banking theory, please?
So traditionally, free banking was the alternative to central banking for countries that were on a gold standard or a silver standard. So central banking meant monopolizing the issue of these paper notes that said, we will pay you on demand so many ounces of gold or silver, so many dollars, so many pounds sterling, so many pesos, so many gold yen. There's no reason to nationalize that business any more than there is to nationalize checking accounts. So it was just a normal part of banking. And the movement for central banking was a movement in the first place before they invented macroeconomic policy. It was a movement to nationalize the issue of paper currency, of banknotes. So the free bankers were arguing against, in particular in London, the Bank of England's monopoly. There was a law that said no other bank in the vicinity of London may compete with the Bank of England in this business. Although banks outside of London, in the other large cities in England and throughout Scotland, were issuing their own currency. But redeemable for the basic money in the system. So they all said, we'll pay the bearer on demand so many pounds sterling, which was a silver coin in those days.
That's a little bit complicated for our students to understand.
Okay.
How is it a system where the banks, where the paper notes, where the dollar bills that we have doesn't need to be necessary from the government or for the central bank. It could be from any other private bank. And actually, I don't know if you know, but the Ecuadorian history has had a long history of banks issuing notes in the very beginning of the 20th century.
Well, almost every country did before the government stepped in to monopolize it. So it's kind of the natural system. But if you want something to think about it, I mean, an easier way to think about it, we're all accustomed to traveler's checks, right, which are currency-like liabilities of a private firm. American Express is a private firm that issues these $100 notes, and what makes them valuable? You can take them to American Express and they'll give you $100 for them. So it's a similar thing if you have a commercial bank issuing these kind of notes, but they have to redeem them for the basic money, which in this case would be US dollars.
But in this case, we need to trust in the banks and in the banking system.
Right, so it would be voluntary. Nobody would have to take them. Yeah. If you want to hold Federal Reserve notes, you hold them. And if a bank wants to convince you to hold its liabilities, just the way they have to convince you to hold a checking account, they have to make it attractive. They have to make it easy to access. What they do in Scotland and Northern Ireland is they stock the cajero automáticos with their own notes. So that's what you get when you put in your card and take out currency. That's how they get in circulation.
But in this case, we don't have a central bank, so we don't have this moral hazard. So we have a more sound financial system.
Yes.
Does it work that way, one step to the other?
I think it's been a big improvement in the Ecuadorian banking system. The fact that there's no longer two currencies operating, and so no longer an exchange risk within the bank, it's made life much simpler for them. And because they don't have a central bank standing by to bail them out with dollars, they're much more prudent.
That's really interesting.
They're holding better, stronger reserves and safer assets.
That's really interesting. That's why what I want to show you, and I want to speak with you, and I think the Ecuadorian can show to the world, because we are very much a proxy to a free banking system.
Yep.
There is not a central bank which is the ultimate lender, so there is not this moral hazard. The very same financial system that in the year 99 was totally in bankruptcy. The whole system was totally in bankruptcy.
Right.
15 years later.
And it's not because the bankers have changed. It's because the incentives have changed.
The very same
and
bankers,
the environment has changed.
And that's the point. In 15 years, we have nowadays 30% of the reserves. We have really a sound system. So what's your point about it?
Well, it's not a complete shock. I mean, that's what goes on in Panama. That's what goes on in offshore banking centers where there's nobody standing by with deposit insurance or lender of last resort. In order to attract business, the banks have to behave prudently, so they do.
The Ecuadorian government doesn't seem to think this way, and they had do a very new law which put very much restrictions on banks, and they say that the banks should do the business with governments or whatever business they think. What do you think about the government saying to the banks where to put their money?
Well, they can't say that, and we think you're not being prudent enough. What they're saying is we want to allocate credit to people we think are worthy.
Yeah.
And I mean, I don't want to speculate as to whether they're buying votes by this kind of policy, but that would be the suspicion, right? That they have constituencies who they are trying to serve without actually using tax money. You can just direct the bank to do it, and then it doesn't appear in the fiscal ledger.
What's the experience show us that it's most likely to happen in 10 years or 15 years if the banks are directing it?
Oh, that you'll have unprofitable banks that are in deep trouble. I mean, look across the developing world and you see the failure of this kind of directed investment policy of so-called development banks doing it as government agencies, complete failures, big waste of money, or directing commercial banks to do it. It's a recipe for a weak banking system.
And what about a weak banking system without a central bank? Is it more dangerous than?
No, I mean, without a central bank, the banks will behave more responsibly.
But they are not allowed to behave responsibly because the government are directing the credit.
Well, then you have a problem. I'm not sure what to advise, except that people should tell the government to stop weakening the banks. I mean, let the banks behave prudently.
What about, let's speak a little bit about the future. What do you, I mean, first of all, I mean, the Ecuador the dollarization took place in the year 2000, but the US dollar is not the same the year 2000 and the year 2014 because of the financial crisis of 2008. Do you see any troubles in it?
Well, the remarkable thing is that we went through that financial crisis without a big burst of inflation. Yeah. In fact, we had a year of deflation. So from the point of view of the stability of the purchasing power of the dollar, which is the main concern other countries that use the dollar would have, it came through okay. The interest rates in the US did not shoot up, which is one kind of financial crisis, and they've been held very low. So that's actually makes interest rates lower in the rest of the dollarized world. Of course, interest rates are higher in Ecuador than in the US because, especially on government bonds, because there's default risk.
And obviously default risk.
There's default experience.
and there is no default, but almost default spreading since the year 2000. That's 2009. The government did this kind of things. But we have been speaking about Ecuador. Do you think there is any other chance that any other? No, let's go about again. I am a liberal economist, and I see my libertarian friends in the U.S. saying that the federal government is stealing us, and the U.S. dollar is a very bad currency. And then we are here in Latin America praying for a currency like the U.S. dollars. May you explain this paradox?
Well, it's a question of what is the alternative. I would like to improve the money in the United States, but I recognize, so it's not perfect, but it may be the best thing available in a place like Ecuador, in other countries that have chosen to dollarize or to link to the dollar in some other way. So it may be the best of the alternatives that are actually available. I mean, no small country today can go back on the gold standard by itself. That's not going to work. So the most stable, most widely used international currency is the US dollar. I mean, you could use the Swiss franc. That has a slightly better track record, but it's not as widely accepted, so there are some disadvantages there.
Do you think the Ecuador experience can be an example for any other countries?
Yes, I've been to Costa Rica and recommended that they should consider dollarizing, and pointing to Ecuador and El Salvador and Panama, of course, as examples of how they could have lower inflation, deeper financial markets, sounder banking system.
And what about Venezuela?
I haven't been invited to Venezuela, but yes, well, you can imagine the government resisting very hard, very strongly in Venezuela before conceding. I don't know how much popular dollarization there is in Venezuela. I mean, it must be illegal, right?
Yeah, it's legal, and I do know that some libertarian friends in Venezuela are praying and are advocating for dollarization of the Ecuadorian economy. But they have many other problems in there, other than monetary ones. Can it be the dollarization of many other countries a first step towards the nationalization of the money that Hayek used to advocate for?
Well, in a way, it denationalizes the money in the countries that are adopting an external currency, much as being on the gold standard denationalized the money. But it is in the last resort the national money of the United States. So we would have to do something to, put it outside the reach of the government of the United States to talk about it being denationalized.
But just like a first step towards that point.
Well, it reduces the number of national currencies in the world, yes. I mean, it does represent a step toward monetary freedom. I mean, that's the goal. I mean, it's an expression of freedom of choice, and I think in the United States too, people should be free to use whatever currency they want. I was just at a conference earlier this week talking about Bitcoin, and there's a danger that the government will try to stop the progress of Bitcoin by claiming that it's, used by money launderers and terrorists and whoever. So the transmitters of Bitcoin have to gather information on their clients just as banks do. Well, that's going to slow down make it a much less attractive option.
Bitcoin is a very big issue.
That's another big issue.
Yeah.
So people in Ecuador should be free to use Bitcoin as well.
But it's almost one of the few countries that is not allowed to use
That's
Bitcoins.
right.
That's quite
Ecuador and Bolivia, I believe.
Yeah. Obviously, that has a reason why we can see it. Do you see any improvements in the practice of the financial systems through the last 20, 30, 45, 50 years in the light of the experience? Do you think the experience it's working well and the theorists are...
Well, the financial crisis should have chastened us from thinking that we've solved the problem of how to make the banking system stable. No, I think we've created a great deal of moral hazard in the U.S. banking system through deposit insurance, through lender of last resort, and through too big to fail policies. And I don't think we've reversed that. We had a big monetary reform after the crisis, a big financial regulatory reform called the Dodd-Frank bill. And it's 2,000 pages and growing, but it still doesn't address the problem of too big to fail. In fact, it reinforces the idea that some institutions are so important that they can't be allowed to fail. But then the government becomes more involved in their management. And so they become less independent and less standing on their own feet.
And what about the academic world? Do you see the young scholars?
Well, I like to think that the financial crisis woke up some economists to the limitations of the models they were working with, and the idea that with a few equations we can tell the central bank what to do, and that advice will keep everything completely smooth.
Do you really think that we as academics had learned something? The academic establishment had learned something?
I see more people doing research that is questioning the institutional framework and thinking deeply about issues of the incentives that face the regulators and how to avoid moral hazard problems.
And do you think these improvements, if the academic scholars will have improvements in the financial system?
I don't think that's happened yet.
Will happen.
But I hope it will. But there's a very strong vested interest in the large banks. They're very comfortable now with the way they are regulated, or the way the government pretends to regulate them.
But from another point of view, I see in Latin America and in Europe, I see many improvements in how the financial system works and the monetary policies. I mean, we have Colombia, Mexico, Peru, Chile, with quite good monetary policies in the light of the information of the
In terms of inflation, yes.
Yes.
So I was talking about financial regulation, but yes, in terms of inflation, there's been a big change since the 1970s.
1970s?
In 1970s was the era where there was double-digit inflation in the U.S., 20% inflation in Great Britain, and everybody's come down from there. But also in the developing world, it's come down from,
Actually, in the developing world, probably 10 or 15 years later, it took to the step.
Right, but it's down to single digits now, which is a big improvement.
But in the 90s, we have in Argentina, in Ecuador, we have this double digits, and then we still have double digits in place like Venezuela or like countries or Argentina that they're still in this socialism of the 21st century. Do you think it is linked, the socialism, with bad monetary policies?
Yes. I mean, if you look at the cases of hyperinflation, it's always money printed to pay the government's bills. And as Margaret Thatcher famously said about socialism, it works fine until you run out of other people's money. And then the corollary is you have to start printing more money. But that's the story in Zimbabwe. That was the story in Argentina.
That's the story. Let's speak a little bit about the future. I mean, after the dollarization of a country, we still have in Ecuador 9% of deficit with government is in the top petrol price. So it should be a very good moment to save, but instead we have 9% of, and we have a very strong problems in the public spending, and then it's push the economy and the monetary system. Do you think it can be hold a dollarization with great public spending?
Well, we haven't seen as much improvement there as we would have hoped. But even before dollarization, I believe Ecuador was borrowing internationally in dollars, right? And that's a common experience. And so a country that's borrowing in a currency they don't print has to convince the lenders that they will pay them back in something they can't just print up to pay them back. And so you think the lenders would insist that they be committed to a sound fiscal policy that will enable them to pay back the loans. And yet we saw in the case of Greece, lenders seem to have fallen asleep and thought that somebody else would pay them back if Greece didn't pay them back. And in that case, it was understandable because the European Union and the European Central Bank and the IMF all jumped in and said, oh, we have to rescue the lenders to Greece. Although in the end, they suffered a default. There was a default.
But not exactly. They didn't officially say it was a default. I thought every economist will think that it was a default.
They didn't make the promised payments on time, although, yes, some of the recipients agreed not to claim it was a default, although there are still holdouts. But in the case of Ecuador, you've had defaults despite nobody promising to bail you out and nobody bailing you out. And that's why the government is facing high interest rates. But that doesn't seem to have stopped them from running deficits.
So let's say you said very interesting three things. First of all, it is that we people who we are saying economists that were thinking about that thought before that the dollarization will cut public spending or public deficit, and it didn't happen. And then you gave two explanations quite interesting. First of all, the lenders, they don't really saw the risk, or they were too confident with the currency and they didn't say what it was behind it. Are they a little bit guilty? Or?
Well, I mean, yes, and I think, but they lost their own money, hopefully. So lenders who are more prudent should take their place, right? And we hope that they will learn from the experience.
From the lender point of view, there is also another problem, is that many lenders, they don't really lose their own money, if not their clients' money. So there is also this little bit problem with lenders in the financial markets.
In a way, it's the current monetary policy in the United States, which is keeping interest rates close to zero in the United States, sends savers in the U.S. looking for something better than a zero return. And if they're not careful, they can see government bonds paying 7% and say, wow,
in
what a
US
great
dollars
idea.
currency.
In U.S. dollars, no
7%,
devaluation risk, but they need to look at the default risk. I always tell my students, if you live in El Paso, Texas, you can get 1% on your bank account. If you look across the border to Juarez, Mexico, you can get 8% on your bank account. Why doesn't everyone in El Paso go to Juarez? Well, two things. One, it's in Mexican pesos, but the other is that it's not going to be worth as many dollars at the end of the year. Right? The exchange rate's going to change, but default has the same effect.
Okay. What do you think are the best possibilities of, we didn't speak about that, the challenge of the dollarization of the dollar. We have been speaking about the dollar as becoming a weaker currency. That can be one of them. And I'm quite afraid of that after all this quantitative easing, 1, 2, and the other one will be their own Ecuadorian government issuing their own currency with this electronic monetary.
So the biggest problem in Ecuador, it seems to me, is that the government is not embracing dollarization, and they're resisting dollarization, and they would like to find a way to loosen the straitjacket, right? You don't have that problem in Panama. You don't have that problem in El Salvador. They're quite happy with it. But if the government is looking for a way to undermine it, as the Argentine government was with its convertibility arrangement, they can probably find a way. And so, yeah, you have to be worried about this new proposal to have the government issue dollar-denominated cell phone credits, that it's another way of issuing a monetary liability. You have to worry whether the redeemability, the fact that you can, the proposal that you can trade them one for one with dollars, whether that's credible, whether that will last, or whether at some point people will be stuck with these pseudo dollars, unable to convert them one to one.
So, do you think it is possible to go back to de-dollarize an economy?
Well, if an economy has been officially dollarized, yeah, I would. One example is Liberia. Liberia adopted the US dollar. They had a Liberian dollar, but it was only the small change. It was only the coins. That was up to about the Second World War. Then the government decided it wanted to make a profit by issuing paper dollars. Initially, of course, it was 1-to-1 in order to get people to accept them.
Yeah.
Now it's more than 90-to-1 Liberian dollars to US dollars, and they're depreciating rapidly, about 15% last year, if I recall. Right, so yeah, so the first step is the government introduces dollar-denominated liabilities of its own, which it insists are the same thing as US dollars, but that's only true if it's 100% certain that you can redeem them for US dollars.
But what happened in Liberia? The people still use dollars and it didn't.
Well, that's right. People learned not to trust the Liberian dollar. There's still about 90% of their own savings in US dollars. And so the Liberian dollar doesn't really accomplish much for the government. But I think they regard it as a matter of face, of sovereignty. They didn't, to abolish it would be to admit that they made a mistake.
My hope is that once we recognize that the dollarization, the currency is adopted by the people,
yes,
it's quite complicated to go all the way back because we are going to a war situation and the people already know and they are using their dollars. So it's quite complicated to take away from the dollarization. So I have really much hope on this.
In Argentina, they had to go to extreme measures, right? Confiscating people's dollar bank accounts. It's just incredible.
It didn't still work that way because still, if you go from the main Buenos Aires streets, people are selling you dollars on the streets. So it still works.
But people with savings keep them in dollars in Uruguay. They know better than to keep them at home now.
Yeah. Yeah,
but that's a big loss to the Argentine economy. It's a capital exit.
Yeah, it's a big loss there, but still the people have a little bit. They can hold their saving in dollars because they already know that the peso, Argentine peso, is not a good currency. And now let's speak about good futures for the dollar, for the American economy, Ecuadorian monetary system.
Okay.
We have been speaking about bad ones. I mean, this digital currency, this dollarization. There's the good possible features. For example, the first one, you're saying about making Ecuador as another example of a free banking system. Do you think it can really work? Do you think it can?
Well, it can work. I don't know whether it's a politically viable proposal.
Yeah.
We have lots of historical examples, and we have the living examples I mentioned where it does work.
What about?
But it has to be allowed to work, of course.
What about Latin America currency? What about the idea of a Latin America currency union, or at least Bolivarian currency union, or whatever?
Well, would you trust it?
Venezuela, Argentina, all together? No thanks.
I mean, the European Central Bank was a remarkable project in that to make it viable, they had to get Germany to agree.
Yeah.
And Germany wrote the Constitution, basically, and it's held up okay. There's some cracks appearing.
Unfortunately, the Germans are not nowadays. They don't hold.
That's
the
right.
president.
They're not in charge anymore. They are not the median voter, you might say, on the.
And the
board.
strong monetary policies, economists that used to be at the European Central Bank, they went away because they didn't agree with that policy.
No, that's right. Some of the German members actually resigned.
Because they
over the Greek bailout.
Yeah. So you can have a system that at the beginning can seem quite good, but then if you get the tools to get worse, it probably will get worse.
Right. So there has to be an actual commitment to the words that are on the piece of paper that says price stability is our only goal or something like that.
But let's speak about this future of what do you think in general about these regional currencies and special?
Well, I think if you left it up to the people, the most popular regional currency would be the US dollar.
So the
just
point is,
for lack of a better alternative.
Why do we need regional currency if we already have our regional currency, which is the US dollar?
So if you could make a Bolivarian currency as trustworthy as the dollar and introduce it as an option. Let the people decide whether they want to use it, but don't force anybody.
Don't force. That's that's the key issue. Let's probably finish with this point of forcing people. Yeah.
So what you're saying is that this regional system should introduce the US dollar as the regional currency, for example, for, I don't know, Venezuela, Ecuador, Bolivia, and other countries from South America?
Well, it's not so much introduced. The dollar is already here.
But in the region,
It might be useful to have a treaty that says we all agree to let our citizens use whatever currency they want, and we won't place obstacles in the way of importing and exporting whatever currency they want to use. And in that way, you get a spontaneous integration of the economies.
And that actually will help all the economies get better and increase.
Makes trade easier. Yes, lets people save with more confidence.
Okay, so I have another question for you, regarding the dollarization of our economy. What could be a good currency for us if we're not, the government is getting this idea of not getting the US dollar anymore in our within our economy, but what other currency do you think could be good as the US dollar that has been stabilized our economy during these 15 years?
Well, if you look at things that actually exist today, there's the euro, there's the Swiss franc, there's the yen, but I'm not sure about the yen right now. But you don't have as much trade with any of those economies as you do with the United States. So those don't.
So that
wouldn't be an improvement over the dollar. I mean, if we look to the past, we can see the era of the classical gold standard, but the gold standard always had a fairly tenuous hold in Latin America. Countries would go on and go off. What didn't seem to be as durable, but under the strain of the fiscal authorities wanting to print money for various reasons.
And as an American monetarist, what would you answer to those people that say that using American dollars within Latin America is a new way of imperialism from America?
Well, you can think of it as completely separate from U.S. foreign policy. And you raised the question earlier about the fairness of the seigniorage going to the U.S. Yeah. There was a proposal in the U.S. Congress a few years ago that the dollarization seigniorage ought to be shared. Yeah. So U.S. authorities would come and see how many dollars there are in Ecuador and give you 80% of the float profit that the U.S. is making. What worries me about that is then it does become a U.S. policy, and it seems like the U.S. is now endorsing and backing the system, but that creates moral hazard problems. And now the U.S. has a reason to meddle in the economies of other countries, which they shouldn't do.
Let's say two interesting things about that. First, who was the senator of the congressman who raises that question?
Connie Mack of Florida, yeah.
Whose advisor was your?
My former student, Kurt Schuler, yes.
That's quite interesting because it's still. And the second one is actually something really interesting that I discovered during these interviews is that the American government didn't know anything about the dollarization of the formal dollarization of the Ecuadorian economy till the day after. The president of Ecuador didn't call anyone in the United States
to say,
good. Hey, so some people say this is an American imperialist policy, yeah. And actually the Americans didn't know anything about that.
Right. And of course, before that, the Ecuadorian savers didn't call up the United States and say, I've got my savings in US dollars, is that okay with you?
Because actually some people confuse that, and my savings are mine, although right. They are issued in US dollars, in Ecuadorian money, in gold, or in lands. My savings are mine, and not for the government who takes the note that I choose to hold my savings.
So I'm not sure what arrangements Ecuador has now. I know that in Panama they get block shipments of fresh $100 bills from the New York Fed.
Can you believe that as long as I know, they don't have any kind of official arrangements?
So
they took their new dollars in the commercial banks, not in the Fed, from the commercial banks.
Okay.
So they don't really have any kind of arrangement, which is quite good because everyone says this is an American policy, American imperialism. Actually, the American government doesn't know anything about that. It's quite interesting. Let's speak a little bit about freedom. You said that word many times. Freedom of choice.
Right.
Why do you think it's so important? Freedom, monetary freedom.
Well, if we want people to have the money they want, if our goal is to promote human flourishing and well-being, then people are the best judges of their own well-being. And we don't really have another hour to talk about political philosophy, but I mean, my view is that there's no reason to interfere in the choices people make in the marketplace. Yeah, you stop people from hitting each other and shooting each other, that sort of thing, but buying and selling decisions, there's no violence there. And let people decide what they want to buy and what they want to sell. And that's a free economy, and that leads to the most prosperity, as well as the most freedom. People get to run their own lives. We treat them as, competent, sovereign individuals.
Quite interesting. Do you have any other question for Roy?
Well, going just for an closure this meeting, I would like to tell me more about how do you see the Ecuadorian economic system for the future? 10-year term or more, or probably 25-year term. How do you see our economy is going to develop? Or is going to increase, decrease? Regarding all these currency problems we have now.
Well, currency problems you don't have now.
well, not.
Right? The currency system is one of the bright points. The real problem, from my perspective, is the fiscal policy system. I look at the growth of the size of government as a share of GDP, and that path cannot be sustained. No. Right? That growth cannot be sustained. And it seems to me that the growth of real output in Ecuador is overstated if the amount of it that's financed by borrowing from China is not subtracted. Right? It's easy to have a high standard of living if you ignore your credit card debt. So that would be my main concern. I think if the monetary system is not tampered with, if you allow people to choose the currency they use, continue to allow them to do that, and allow the banks to operate in a prudent way, then the future is bright. I mean, the model that you should be moving toward is Panama, where the banking system is quite deep, quite well developed. You can get long-term mortgages in Panama that you can't get elsewhere in Latin America. So it's very much in the interests of the common people.
We're going to finish with this bright future, of these good remarks about the future. We hope we go towards Panama and not towards Venezuela, which some of us were quite afraid of that.
Argentina is going toward Venezuela. You don't want to go toward Argentina.
Toward Venezuela, that's the way. Thank you very much. It was a real pleasure.
Thank you.
Do you want to make any other final remarks?
No, well, I'm...
Good.
That'll do.
Thank you very much, Mr. White. It was a real pleasure.